Okay, so this evening we're back on Zoom, although there are some people at the venue who braved the inclement weather, and Joshua De Giorgio is our ONSEC is looking after them. Thank you very much, Joshua. We were just saying that it all feels a bit sort of like a COVID throwback day. We were very disappointed, in fact, to have to make this decision to go on Zoom today. We were all determined after COVID to start meeting in person together, but today's inclement weather has kept us indoors. We hope that there will be as good an audience and as usual today, and possibly even more numerous. As you know, this series is a collaboration between the ASM and the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta. And thanks go, as always, to the head of department, Dr. Carmen Serracino, and to Professor Nicholas Vella, ASM Vice President. Dr. Huw S. Groucutt will be delivering this evening's lecture, which is entitled Shifting Sands, Changing Narratives, Climate Change and Human Prehistory in Arabia. I'll first introduce Dr. Groucutt and then turn the floor over to him, and we shall hopefully, if he's willing, have time for some questions at the end. So, Dr. Huw Groucutt is a lecturer in Mediterranean prehistory at the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta. His research focuses on the relationship between environmental change and human societies, particularly in Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean. Dr. Groucutt has an undergraduate degree in archaeology and a master's degree from the University of Sheffield and a DPhil in archaeological science from the University of Oxford. Before joining the University of Malta, he had a variety of posts at the University of Oxford, including a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship and with the Max Planck Society in Germany, where he was an independent group leader. He has more than 100 scholarly publications on wide-ranging archaeological interests and has recently been awarded a €2 million European Research Council grant for the Terraform project that he leads, which is investigating the origins, developments, and impacts of agricultural terracing in Malta. This evening, we're going to hear all about human prehistory in Arabia. And just reading the abstract for this talk really made me feel very enthusiastic to hear all about it. So without further ado, over to you, Huw.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the very kind introduction. So as many of you will know, I have two archaeological hats, as it were. So my work in Malta and what I'm going to talk about tonight, my work in Arabia. I've been working in Arabia for more than 15 years now. So it's actually a very nice time for me to be able to think about, what I've been involved in. And over the last 10, 20 years, there's been this really big change in what we know about the prehistory of Arabia. So why is the prehistory of Arabia an important and interesting topic? Arabia is a vast landmass. It's more than 3 million kilometers at the interface between Africa and Eurasia. So it's a real sort of intercontinental nexus, and therefore a key spot for understanding human prehistory. Moreover, it's somewhere which has seen really fascinating past climate change, as I'll come back to. So today we think of Arabia as a very arid place, right? Part of the Saharo-Arabian desert belt. Um, but we now know that over the past, the climate has oscillated between wet and dry conditions. And there's a long, fascinating story of how human societies have, interacted and engaged with these processes of environmental change. So we can almost think of Arabia as a kind of laboratory for human responses to climate change. Um, and just to kind of set the scene, every year we learn more about human prehistory. We are living in a kind of golden age, I would say, for the study of the deep human past. Um, and currently we live in a very unusual period when we are the only human species. If we went back, say, 100,000 years, we would have been in a world where there were multiple species of hominins or humans in a broad sense. So our species, Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, the poorly understood Denisovans in Eastern Asia, and other characters like the so-called hobbits in Southeast Asia. And what my research really looks at is trying to understand why all of these other human species went extinct, but we were able to move through this challenging desert belt and spread across the world. So this is what I've been doing for the last more than 15 years. And I think a key point to emerge from studies in recent years is that this structure of different hominin species reflects a basic kind of geographical structure of the old world. So, oceans and mountains and so on separated the world into more habitable areas. And the desert belt is perhaps, to me, the most interesting of these geographical features because this arid strip separated different populations and species. But as I've mentioned, due to climate change, this desert belt came and went and was transformed. So it's a very dynamic partial barrier, which then sometimes flips to being a kind of route. So with this in mind, one might imagine that people would, agree that Arabian prehistory is very important. Actually, unfortunately, this is far from the case. There's a couple of quotes I've put up here, which I think give an insight into a common thread in the Western psyche, which is the idea that Arabia has always been a kind of empty, desolate place. So in the late 19th century, the Oxford Assyriologist Seiss said that if there's any country which is seen to lie completely outside the stream of ancient history, it is Arabia. In the mid 20th century, the American anthropologist Carlton Kuhn rather poetically, I think it's fair to say, described Arabia as the discarded appendix of the Near East, a cul-de-sac to old, discarded, and forgotten fragments of humanity. And this is how in the West often people think of Arabia as somewhere empty, desolate, and unchanging. Today, we typically find less crude views, but research tends to downplay the role and importance of Arabia. So you can look at many textbooks and publications and find images like this. The classics, it looks a bit like a World War II kind of battle plan, these arrows on maps. And these typically show hypothesized population movements, either bypassing Arabia to the north through the Fertile Crescent, or kind of reluctantly engaging with it through a sort of coastal superhighway, a mythical coastal route which moves around the margins of Arabia. But still, either of these perspectives is basically not engaging with the reality of the landscapes and societies of Arabia. So today I'm going to talk about the research that I've been involved in. So obviously my personal perspectives, but of course this is very much teamwork. I've had the privilege of working with many amazing colleagues and friends. So people like Professor Michael Petralia, Professor Eleanor Sherry, many, many more. And we've worked very closely with the Heritage Commission of the Saudi Ministry of Culture, King Saud University, and many others. So again, this everything I'm saying today is the result of this collective work. Um, when I started my PhD in 2009, there wasn't a single dated pre-Neolithic site anywhere in Arabia. As we can see from this map, in terms of the Arabian Peninsula, we now have a small number of sites. So each of these dots is a paleoanthropological site, right? So either an archaeological site or human fossils. And what we can see is that we know a lot about the East Mediterranean Levant, right? So this coastal strip from kind of southern Turkey down to Jordan. But in terms of the Arabian Peninsula, we still know very, very little. So that's what I've been trying to address with my colleagues, um, and I think we've been quite successful, as I'll discuss. So, firstly, when it comes to deep prehistory to human evolution, often people look at fossils or bones. And at the moment, the entirety of the pre-Neolithic fossil record for hominins in Arabia is this single bone. It's the middle bone of the middle finger, so next to your knuckle. I have to be careful not to flash my middle finger to the audience. And this is the only human fossil we found, despite a lot of looking. It turns out, though, that this particular part of the body is really informative. So the shape of it is distinctively Homo sapiens. So Neanderthals, for example, this bone is a very different shape. And we were able to directly date this bone using a method called uranium series. So we know this is at least 85,000 years old. So it's showing the early presence of humans like us in what is now the really arid heart of the Arabian desert. And there were other sort of, I guess, biological in a sense, hints that we can talk about. So this is another site nearby, so in the Nafud Desert in northern Arabia. Um, it's like many of these sites, the remains of an ancient lake. And in this case, as the lake was drying about 120,000 years ago, many animals and some people were walking around the landscape and they left their footprints. So we have elephant footprints, camel footprints, and a series of human footprints. Based on estimates of the stature of these individuals, they again seem to be Homo sapiens, so humans like us. Um, we also have a very rich record of animal bones. So these are really interesting because they tell us about the kind of animals that humans were hunting, for example, sometimes, but also about the kinds of environments that these early humans were living in. So this is myself and Eleanor Sherry excavating an elephant. It's about 500,000 years old. You can see the trunk in the foreground. Elephants need to eat a huge amount of food, so it's really just visually showing how during these wetter periods, how radically transformed these generally dry areas were. Um, and while we have a lot of animal fossils, typically they're quite fragmentary. when they're exposed to the sun and to like sandstorms and so on, they tend to be quite weathered and damaged. So what we've been doing in the last few years is trying to find places in the landscape which have better preservation. So one of the key places is underground, sheltered from the elements. So for example, this is a lava tube. So a lava tube is similar to a cave, but it's not a limestone feature. It's when you get a lava flow and the surface cools faster and creates like a roof, and then it keeps flowing underground and sometimes creates a cave-like feature. So this example is called Jirsan. It's the longest lava tube in Arabia. And a few hundred meters underground, one comes to this chamber. This is a hyena den. When cavers had explored this site a few years ago, they reported hearing growling sounds and seeing kind of glowing eyes in the dark. Luckily, when we were there, there were no one was home. But basically, this is somewhere that hyenas have been dragging animal and some human remains for at least the last 10,000 years. You can see in the background that's Matthew Stewart, paleontologist, who also works with us at Latnia. And Dr. Stewart spent a lot of time in this in this chamber. I think this place has the worst smell in the world. 10,000 years of hyena, um, rotting meat and feces. And just to show you, this is a 1 meter square, just incredibly rich. And sites like this are giving us much better preserved remains than the kind of open air sites. So when we turn to archaeology, while it's true that it's only in the last few years we've got dated sites, we've known for a long time that there were lots of sites that are kind of surface scatters. So you can go and walk around and you can find stone tools and so on. And in this map for my PhD days, I added up all of the published examples of these surface sites. And what this shows is an incredibly rich archaeological record. Actually, Arabia has sites from every kind of major cultural phase. So going back to probably Homo erectus at least, all the way through to the Neolithic and more recently. But the challenge was that none of these sites were scientifically dated. So they were valuable because they showed us the kinds of material culture available. They showed us how humans were using the landscape, but without scientific dates, we can't tell how this relates to climate, for example. So what we've been doing is trying to work on localities where we can apply scientific dating methods. So particularly ancient lakes. And through doing this, we've built a really quite rich archaeological record, extending back at least 400,000 years. And each of these phases of human occupation correlates with a period of improved climate, right? So every so often, there's more rainfall, and humans moved into the area and left their stone tools. What I think is interesting here is that the stone tools from each of these different phases is very distinct. So it doesn't look to me like there's long-term kind of continuity. Rather, it looks like populations move in, then when the dry conditions return, they're probably locally dying out. So one of the big things we've been looking at is trying to understand who were these early humans, where did they come from? Um, And there's different ways we can, think about this and visualize it. So, for example, we can, like on the left, we can plot the location of archaeological sites. We can think about um, how these sites relate to things like ancient rivers, and we can draw kind of arrows on maps showing possible routes for human movements. This is fine, but it's quite sort of broad. And the problem with this is it makes it look like these humans were kind of aiming somewhere, whereas in reality, they weren't aiming for places. They were moving around the landscape, pursuing resources. So another thing that we can do um, is a more kind of quantitative approach. So this is on the right, a paper we published almost 10 years ago now, where we mapped every example of a kind of climate archive showing wetter conditions, so lakes, springs, and so on, and then extrapolated this to the kind of catchment level. And what this shows is that during these repeated periods of time, so here about 80,000 years ago, there were these continuous corridors of lakes and rivers which humans could use to move into Arabia. And there's different ways we can think about this. In another study, we looked at the more recent archaeological record, so the Neolithic and so on. But I think this also applies to earlier periods. And what we've done here is use satellite imagery to map um, ephemeral water sources. So this is places in the last 30 years. When there's a storm, you get a kind of temporary water source. And this is probably how it's always been, in broad terms. And what humans probably did was move around the landscape, essentially chasing the rain. So, storms would be quite unpredictable, and they would move around the landscape in pursuit of water and other resources. And over time, these kind of multi-directional movements would lead them to spread into new areas. And this is probably a lot more kind of meaningful than the idea of a migration with a big arrow drawn on the map. So by doing this, we have constructed this really interesting archaeological record for the kind of heart of Arabia for the first time. And this extends back to at least 400,000 years when we find many of these so-called hand axes. So these are some examples here, really beautiful tools. These are like the longest lived tool that humans have used. And we found literally thousands of these artifacts in Arabia. And this is an example of what these sites look like. Typically, these are these ancient lake beds. So this is a good example. So it's a kind of hollow or a kind of depression between two large dunes. And every time the climate improved, there's more water, these small lakes formed. So beginning here 400,000 years ago, and then roughly every 100,000 years, a lake formed, and around each lake we find hundreds, sometimes thousands of stone tools, of animal bones, and so on. And it's these kind of sites that we've used to build this record. These lakes are great because they were magnets for people in the past, but also they're places where these remains can be kind of buried and preserved, and that we can then date them. So a lot of my work has been in northern Arabia, but also I've worked across the peninsula. So, for example, this is somewhere called Mundafan in southern Arabia near Yemen. So this is again an ancient lake. You can see the white sediments here. And this is another of these ancient lakes on the edge of the so-called empty quarter or the Rub al Khali. So this is the largest sand desert in the world. And once again, we found that during these kind of wet phases, early humans were moving into these areas and seemingly prospering. So here's an example. This is a lovely Levallois flake, so a very carefully designed, very sharp stone tool dating to about 85,000 years. So one narrative that I've just given you a kind of introduction to is change through time. And that's fine, that's a part of the story. But Arabia is a big place. And something that I'm very interested in pursuing further is trying to understand the kind of spatial variability. So here's an example. This is my colleague Richard Jennings in Central Arabia. And this is basically a very flat kind of granite landscape, but it's separated by these occasional dikes. So these are basically volcanic features made of rhyolite or andesite. And these volcanic dikes are amazing sources of really good stone to make hand axes. So they're actually remarkable, almost like a Shirleyan landscape, thousands and thousands of hand axes. And this site had been studied in the 1970s, but not dated and not studied using kind of modern techniques. So we returned to the area, did more kind of systematic surveys, did some more excavations, and were able to apply kind of modern dating techniques. So in this case, luminescence dating. And what was particularly interesting here is that when we were working at this locality, the hand axes look very simple. They're not like elegant and refined. So we were guessing that they were maybe 1 million years or more old. When we then published the dates, it was quite a surprise. Actually, they're much, much younger. They're about 200,000 years ago. And actually the upper layers of the site are, younger than the dates. At the same time, further north in Arabia, we already have full kind of Middle Paleolithic, like those small Levallois flakes. So in these adjacent parts of Arabia, 200,000 years ago, we have radically different technologies. Perhaps different hominin species are living, adjacent to each other, or some other explanation. But I think it just highlights the way we have to understand change through time, but also change through space. And this narrative, I think, runs through the entirety of Arabian prehistory. So to come to the more recent past, one of the really interesting features of Arabian archaeology is that the desert is full of ancient stone structures, right? So it's a very rocky landscape. People would use rock to make different kind of dry stone structures, from the ritual to the very practical. And one really interesting example are these so-called desert kites, right? They look like a kite, that you fly when you look down on them from a bird's eye view. And these are basically mass kill hunting traps, right? So the idea is you have two converging walls, and these kind of channel animals like gazelle. And then at the end, there's an enclosure with pit traps. So you drive the animals in, and then they can be killed. There are thousands and thousands of these structures. But what's interesting is that in different regions of Southwest Asia and Arabia, you find different forms. So as you can see here, each of these marked regions has a different kind of shape of these structures. Is this because they're from different time periods, or is it because there's kind of spatial variation? The problem at the moment is that we have very few dates. We know some of these desert kites are at least 10,000 years old. It's probably the case that some of the variation is to do with different time periods, But it also looks to me like there's a pattern where the further south one moves in Arabia, the more simple they get. They get smaller and simple, and there's less of them. So again, I think there's a story of spatial variation within the peninsula. And a kind of final example of this, um, another site we worked on in northern Arabia. It's called Jebel Qatar 101. So you can see the red dot in the map. At this site, we found very interesting Neolithic artifacts, including things like arrowheads. Arrowheads are very interesting because they're often made to a very particular kind of cultural recipe. Like people would inherit the particular ways of making them. And one of the forms we found at this site are what are called Helwan points. And these very distinctive forms were previously only known from the East Mediterranean Levant. So you can see in the map. But here we have them way inland, right? In the middle of this what is now desert area. So one story is, sure, there's some kind of connection. The thing is, when we studied this in more detail, it turns out that while the end form, the typology, looks very similar to Helwan points in the Levant, the way that they're making them is actually very, very different. So what does this mean? Is it because they had different kinds of stone to use? Or, for example, were people just copying like the end product? We're not really sure yet. So we need to have these methods which we can, look at time and space and look in detail at the kind of processes to really disentangle these different processes leading to like material culture variation. Okay, so that was a bit of a whirlwind through the emerging archaeological record of Arabia. What I'd like to talk about now is the climatic context. Um, this is something again that we're working on very intensively. So a lot of what we know comes from climate modeling. So this is basically similar to a weather forecast today, but on much, longer time scales. So there's obviously more uncertainty, more complexity. But as you can see in figures like this, basically what happens is periodically the monsoonal rain in places like East Africa moves much further north. And it's this monsoonal rainfall that transforms Arabia into this sort of grassland with lakes and rivers. And again, we can even think about the kind of seasonality. So monsoonal rainfall is summer rainfall. So it's very different from the kind of winter rainfall that you find in the Mediterranean region. Um, And there's a growing body of evidence on the ground from things like lakes and stalagmites, which kind of, bring meat to the bones of this climate story. So this is showing a record for the last 1.1 million years from stalagmites from Yemen. This is a paper by my colleague Sam Nicholson and his colleagues. And as you can see, each of these green bars is one of these wet periods when rainfall increased. So we're learning a lot, but the thing is, at the moment, some of these climate models are still quite limited. Different models have slightly different results. And often these models present kind of average conditions, right? So it'll be like average annual rainfall. But humans don't live in averages. And these landscapes are characterized by very kind of stochastic rainfall. So it can be dry for years, and then a huge storm can transform the area for a season, for example. So what we've been doing is looking on the ground and trying to look at sites in the kind of interior of Arabia. So as you can see here, these are all ancient lakes. And these are really kind of evocative, they really clearly show um, how these places change. And we can look at kind of different animals and even microscopic organisms to show that these were like freshwater perennial lakes. The problem with these lakes is that they're very hard to date. It's quite complex to explain why, but it's very hard to get accurate dates. So what we're doing now, so I was over in Saudi Arabia last year, um, and we've been doing this for the last few years, is looking at speleothems, so things like stalagmites, which give these really good climate records. And I mentioned in the past they've been published in kind of Yemen and in the Far East, but until our work, almost nothing was known from the kind of interior of Arabia. And just to give you an example of the landscape, this is myself and Eleanor Sherry doing a kind of survey in a sandstorm. It's a really flat kind of featureless landscape, very challenging. But every so often, you come across these very impressive caves. And caves are great, as I've mentioned, for things like bones, but also for things like these stalagmites. Some of these caves are very challenging to enter, but in some cases, we could get into these cave systems, and some of them have these stalagmites, stalactites, other kinds of cave formations. And these are basically formed by dripping water, and the chemistry of the crystals and even kind of fossil water trapped inside them gives us an amazing record of past climate. So we published a few months ago our first study on this, and remarkably, again, this is all due to like advances in dating methods. We could show that for the last 7 million years, there's this amazing climate record. So these repeated wet phases and then dry phases, alternating. What's particularly interesting here is that we can look at something called the oxygen isotopes of these stalagmites, and this tells us about where the water that formed them comes from. And basically, what it's showing is that the older samples are really highly monsoonal, but when we come through to the more recent past, that monsoonal influence is weakening. So it's not just getting drier, it's that the monsoon is weakening. And we come to a situation more like today when Arabia doesn't have much monsoonal influence. So in somewhere like northern Arabia, when there's a storm today, it's more of one of these Mediterranean winter storms. So we have more to come on this speleothem climate record, but it's a really kind of promising and exciting way to understand past climate because we can date so accurately these formations. Um, Another aspect I'm really kind of passionate about emphasizing is that we can't just directly extrapolate climate to human societies. We have to understand how climate manifests in terms of environmental change. So, for example, rivers are key because rivers can transport water, right? So, even if somewhere has little rainfall, if there is a river, it can mean a huge impact for early humans. And this is particularly the case in Arabia because Arabia is basically a big kind of tilted plateau, right? So the western part of Arabia is basically like a mountain highland chain from Yemen through Asir and the Hijaz. And what this means is that about 90% of the drainage goes inland. So once you increase the rainfall in that mountain belt, you get these rivers that flow to the east. And this is, I think, a really key point that we need to think about the fundamental character of these landscapes to understand how climate change impacts these early humans. And likewise, things like volcanoes, right? This is the city of Medina, and you can see all these big black lava flows. So in the medieval period, for example, there was a big eruption that was heading straight for the city, and at the last minute, it kind of changed direction. And actually, going back in time, we know that Arabia is a really volcanically active place. So in this map, each of these red areas is a volcanic lava field. And again, thanks to improved dating, we now have this amazing record showing when these volcanoes were active. And I did a study trying to sort of synthesize part of this evidence. And what it shows is that during the periods humans were in Arabia, there were all kinds of volcanoes erupting. So again, what impact that had on humans is a really interesting story. But in terms of how it changed the environment, I think it's a big factor because typically these eruptions create lava flows, right? The lava flows down a valley and then it cools and makes like a natural reservoir. You can see examples like this. So basically, because these flows are plugging the valleys, you get lakes forming. So the climate hasn't changed, but the hydrology has. There's a lot more water now. And I think, again, thinking through these details of how these environments change is really important, right? It's not just about local climate change. Okay, so for the final few minutes, I want to change tack a little bit and try and think about how different subfields, different regional studies within archaeology can kind of complement each other, can cross-fertilize each other. Because I think part of the problem these days is that people are so specialized, they tend to only work in kind of one time period in one part of the world. And this can really limit our horizons. So something I'm interested in developing is trying to think about comparisons between different kinds of archaeology, right? So desert archaeology and sort of island archaeology. For example, this is somewhere called Juba. Um, so it's an ancient lake basin, actually about the size of Malta, thinking about it, surrounded on all sides by a sand sea. So you can see these miles and miles of sand dunes. And I think it could be interesting to think about some of the theories and methods from kind of island and maritime archaeology and trying to apply them to these places. So these oases are kind of analogous to islands, and the sand seas are like seas. And there's not been that much kind of theoretical thought in desert archaeology. Um, Likewise, when we think about the meaning of cultural change, I think again there's some important lessons that we can think about. So this is from paper by John Robb. As my students will know, I have a kind of love-hate relationship with this paper. I actually don't agree with much of it, but I think it's a really valuable and an important paper. And the argument here is that when we think about things like the Temple period in Malta, these are often seen as the product of geography. So Malta is isolated, remote, and this creates, unusual developments, right? So that's what's shown here in the top row. This idea that the Temple period flows from the geography, and that's the story. What Rob suggests is a different perspective, which is that we should start from kind of culture, and that cultural change was key, and that this was then kind of mapped onto geography. We can debate the reality of this, but I think it's an interesting perspective. Because, for example, Rob argues that, okay, the Temple period is quite different from things in Sicily and Malta and Italy, but at the same time, within Sicily and Italy, there are areas that are almost as different from each other as either are from Malta. So you don't need island status to have these like major cultural differences. And I think what Arabia allows us to do is to look at this question. Can we have kind of cultural islands, which are not geographical islands, but are like geographically circumscribed developments? So, for example, if you look at satellite imagery in northwestern Arabia, you can notice thousands of these enigmatic rectangles. And these are a kind of stone structure that are called mustatil. Mustatil is rectangle in Arabic. And a few years ago, I led the first study on the ground looking at these. This is how they look. There's sort of two low walls connecting two platforms, and it turns out these are Neolithic ritual structures. So in these platforms at either end, sometimes you find like ritual animal deposits, so things like cattle skulls. And here's an example of one of the areas we worked in. So you can see in the middle, these are these ephemeral kind of playa, right? These clay areas that when it rains, small lakes form. And all of these red areas are these mustatil. So highlighting how kind of rich an archaeological landscape it is. And in the last few years, other researchers have really advanced what we know about this. So, for example, Mel Kennedy and Hugh Thomas from Sydney have been doing amazing work. And there's now, as shown here, I think almost 2,000 of these mustatil known, but they only occur in this one particular area of northwest Arabia. In that sense, I think they are kind of a cultural island, right? I think that's something we can continue to think through. And there are other examples. So, for example, my colleague Maria Guanin has led interesting work looking at particular types of rock art. And again, there's a regionally specific form of rock art, which are these life-sized camel engravings, which again only occur in like one part of northwestern Arabia. These are, in a sense, cultural islands. Um, I think we need to think about the extent to which, though, we can apply this to somewhere like Malta, right? So personally, I think something like the Temple period is still largely geographically driven, but by looking at these terrestrial landscapes, we can get a better handle on the kind of variation we can expect in different landscapes. And finally, another example that comes from things like animal domestication. So you may have heard the kind of nickname of camels as ships of the desert. And in the same way that in Mediterranean prehistory, sails transformed the cultural geography, in Arabia, once people have domesticated camels, it was kind of a game changer. I think this is a really key example, highlighting that as important as climate is, we also have to factor in human creativity, ingenuity, technology. So again, it's like a multivariate perspective looking at these different factors of human social change. So what I would like to do in the future is try and think about how we can apply different sorts of archaeology, and I think this will be a useful exercise to mutually benefit different kinds of archaeology. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Uh, thank, thank you so much, Hugh, for that. Absolutely fascinating. So many questions, possible questions. I'd like to, and thank you for your timing, which was perfect. I'd like to ask anybody who has questions to either put up a hand or write them in the chat, which you'll find at the bottom of the page of the picture. And I don't know that I have anybody yet who's asking questions, but perhaps I can start off with a couple of my own, and then perhaps Joshua can tell us if there's somebody in the audience who wants to ask something.
We have a question here, Trish.
Jolly good. Jolly good. Go ahead.
Can you hear me from here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful talk, Hugh. It opened up so many new ideas, these observations of cultural islands and how not just geography that might affect cultural change, but also the climate. I'm really curious about the monsoons. Because I from what I gathered from your talk, that over time the monsoons seem to move northward. And as you mentioned, the water that's driving the technological advances. And I'm curious to see, like, if you found any regional variations from like south to north as the monsoon levels change. And I'm also really curious if you compare that with Asia, because obviously the monsoons in Southeast Asia, I think they're more prevalent now than in Africa. So I don't know if you've done any comparative studies about that. So.
Yeah, no, I haven't personally done so, but yeah, I mean, from Africa to Asia, how the monsoon changes through time is, one of the most important topics in the world. I can only really speak to the Arabian example. And what's kind of, again, I think I'm very fond of analogies and comparisons, right? So I think something that's kind of interesting is to look at the more recent examples of these wet periods and think about what we can learn from them and apply them to the past. Because for the earlier periods, we still have quite poor kind of dating resolution. But the most recent wet phase, which is kind of, when the Neolithic spread, because that's in kind of radiocarbon dating range, we have a really good handle on it. And what that shows is you can literally trace the monsoon like spreading north and then, reaches a high point and then kind of spreads south again. And what's really fascinating is that when it reaches the far north of Arabia, it's only for like a few hundred years. It's really quite a short period. Um, I think, that probably applies to the past as well. That so the monsoon moves north, but it's only a short window when it gets to the far north, and then it kind of moves south again. And I think the other point is that the kind of seasonality is key. That even during these like green Arabia phases, this would have been a very seasonal landscape. So, during the dry season, it would have been a challenging place to live. So I think thinking through like how different weather systems work is really interesting. And something we're working on now is trying to understand, like, is there a kind of sweet spot where you get the kind of monsoonal rain and the kind of Mediterranean winter rainfall? Like, are there periods when those two systems join? Clue, I think there is. And could that be something kind of interesting as well? But hope that kind of answers your question.
We have another question in the room. Trish, if that's okay.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm very curious about the desert kites. In particular, one of them, one set of kites seem to have this kind of funnel-like shape. And I want to, it immediately reminded me of the sort of pathways developed for animal herding in Malta in more recent times. So I'm just wondering whether in the Paleolithic you can talk about animal herding, or whether that is just something which only develops in the Neolithic. And also in terms of whether it might be possible to identify some of these Maltese past pathways which have the same kind of funnel shape, that maybe they might even date back to very early times.
Yeah, I mean, so these desert kites are Neolithic to more recent, so they're not Paleolithic. Um, but absolutely, I mean, as we learn more, we're learning that, for example, humans had domesticated dogs much earlier than known. So there's all kinds of narratives about human engagement with different animals. And actually, even this week, there have been two new papers about these desert kite-like structures. So one was from the Adriatic and one was from South America. So these are all around the world. And again, a similar idea. A lot of animals, they'll follow kind of straight routes, and I think there's probably different forms. So in the case of Malta, it's, I think, yeah, like goats and so on for herding. In the case of Arabia, it's for gazelle mostly. And it's really interesting because basically some kinds of gazelle made an unfortunate kind of evolutionary choice, so to say, choice. They basically can't jump. So if they're spooked, they just run in a straight line really fast. So all you've got to do is build a wall 0.5 meter high, and you channel these gazelle, and then there were some of these sites being excavated, and then there's a kind of pit trap, and it seems like they're decimating gazelle. So there's some species of gazelle that seem to be almost driven to extinction by these hunting traps. I mean, they are amazing. We're talking about thousands of kilometers of walls. It's like the earliest mass architectural shaping of the planet. So yeah, they're really fascinating.
Any more from the floor? I can't hear you.
Not for now, Trish. We're good in here.
So I got a question about the rock formations. Huw, I mean, clearly volcanic and not so very ancient volcanoes, but fairly, I mean, obviously, relatively speaking, fairly recent ones. What about other formations, rock formations? These, but for example, the uh, the the tools that you showed us, uh, they were very beautiful, and they look really interesting from the geological point of view. Can you tell us something more about the types of rock you came across?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a diversity of geology in Arabia. So the western part is actually, a lot of it is very ancient volcanic rock, but then it has more recent volcanism kind of punching through it. But then in sort of eastern and northern Arabia, there's lots of limestone. So that's where you find flint, for example. Um, it's a very diverse geology. You find almost every kind of rock you can think of, but then also, again, this is why rivers are really interesting. So on the last trip I was there, we were looking at some really ancient rivers, and they rivers transport rocks. These are quite big rivers. So we were finding rocks transported hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. Um, so again, it's the bedrock geology, but then how things like rivers transform the landscape. But yeah, really diverse geology.
Interesting. What about the moving sands?
Mm, mm.
Is there chance that there are other sites that you don't know about because the sands do move, or do you feel that you've sort of they have been discovered more or less what there is, there is?
A good question. It's something we're actually kind of working on. I have some colleagues who hopefully will hurry up. We about 10 years ago, we actually took a ground penetrating radar. Um, and these are machines with different scales, right? So for example, in Bidnia, we've done this with very high resolution small machines. In Saudi, this is like these big, almost they look like big snakes, and we attach them to the back of a 4x4 and drive over the dunes, and it's basically punching down. Um, what they seem to show is, yeah, there are some movements of the dunes, but we haven't seen any indication yet for anything changing that much. And what it seems to be the case that often you can actually tell from different color dunes. So there were like more stable ancient dunes, and then there are more mobile like younger ones, which are smaller. So our kind of working model is that they are quite fixed, the larger ones. But yeah, I need to ask my colleagues where we are with the GPR because that was a while ago. So we're not entirely sure, actually, I guess. Yeah.
Another thing I thought about, is there any underground water that is permanently there or
Yeah.
semi?
Yeah. So that's another. So, my sort of point that we need to think about not just about climate, but more about how the environment changes. Another fundamental point is that there's really huge aquifers. So, that limestone cave area I showed, when it rains, most of that water goes underground, and there's huge aquifers, and that's probably why a lot of these lakes form because the aquifer goes up. So that, yeah, exactly. It's a really important part of the story. Um, Many of these places, yeah, huge aquifers.
Yes, thanks. That's I'm glad to hear that because it's I think it's an interesting idea. This idea of this water going underneath the desert.
And some of these caves, you can actually see where they've been kind of worn smooth from people lowering ropes with buckets to pull water out. And we met some local kind of Bedouin people who, said like their granddad used to collect water from this cave because some of the shafts just go down into the water table.
Well, I can see a hand up at Bellavanti at the hotel.
Yes, we have an additional question from the floor.
Yes, while you're on the topic of this underground water, I'm really curious about the fossil water you mentioned in speleothems. I never heard the term. Is this actual water trapped in the stalactites, or is this just the chemical residue? And how are you dating this? I'm really curious about it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah, so the technical term is fluid inclusions. And basically when these stalagmites form, you sometimes get like small irregularities, and it's literally ancient water that gets trapped inside and crystals grow around it, um, which is amazing because the way the stalagmites form tells us about climate, but it's sort of indirect. With this fossil water, that's literally the water that fell 7 million years ago. So this is working with colleagues who are paleoclimate experts, and this is one of the big boom areas, and there's all kinds of clever chemistry they do. So for example, they can work out the temperature using this fossil water, and obviously that's really important because rainfall is one part of the equation, but so is evaporation, right? So without understanding the temperature, it's again hard to know how the landscape would be. So yeah, these fluid inclusions are like one of the really exciting developments in climate science.
Okay, anybody else going to put their hand up for a question? Joshua? That's it from the floor? Okay. So I think we'll have to leave it there. Absolutely amazing introduction to the Arabian landscape. Something personally I knew very little about, and now I feel I know a little bit more. Thank you for that. And thank you everybody for participating in this evening's event. We look forward to seeing you again next time, hopefully in person, for many of us at least. On Wednesday, 19th November, Dr. Judith Gutt, lecturer at the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta, will speak about Conquering the Sea, a story of ambition, boulders, and ashlar blocks from Amethyst, Cyprus. And that hopefully will be actually at the Bellavanti room at the Grand Hotel Excelsior. Every month until May is filled with fascinating talks, which we will be sending information about, and you'll find to our members, but you can find them also bit by bit. They'll be posted on the ASM website. If anybody's interested in joining the ASM, please do so. You can do that on the website. And sincere thanks from the Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology to Dr. Groucutt for his talk tonight, which I'm sure you will all agree was really, really deeply interesting. Thank you so much, and a very good night to you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.